What's up, music lovers? Welcome back to another episode of Key Track Music Reviews, your channel for brand new music and the listening experience. This is episode 7. I'll be going over the latest studio album by Gli Incogniti titled Il Mondo Al Revescio, or in English, The World Upside Down. I'll share a brief history about the artist, go over some technical stuff, share my impressions of the album, and then finally dig into the two key tracks, in this case the two key pieces that I've selected. Gli Incogniti is a Baroque orchestra from France who formed in 2006 under the direction of violinist Amandine Bayer. They are collectively driven to produce a coherent vision of the music they perform and to embrace unknown or lesser-known works and composers. This album is one of those cases, featuring lesser-known works by the very famous Antonio Vivaldi. It's their 15th studio album, and it was released September 9th, 2022 on the label Harmonia Mundi and recorded at the Auditory Teatre Espai Ter in Spain. Apologies for the bad pronunciations there. The orchestra's director, Amandine Bayer, describes the music of Vivaldi much better than I can, so here's an excerpt from the album's liner notes. The rhythms are simple, but the phrase structure's intelligent. The harmonies are luminous, but can also gleam in the shadows. The instrumentations are dictated by practice and experimentation, but are so ingenious. We are whisked away into the Vivaldian afterlife, into that upside-down world of unbridled octaves and infinitely sustained viola pedals, only to return transformed. My appreciation of Baroque music has grown a lot in the past few years, partly thanks to Two Set Violin on YouTube, and also partly thanks to Apollo's Fire, which is a Baroque orchestra from Cleveland, Ohio. Without hearing them, I wouldn't have known how exciting Vivaldi can be, and I may not even have picked up the album. On the cover is a cool rendering of a tiny habitat or world in a somewhat M.C. Escher style, where things flow in unusual and unintuitive directions. It's really cool, and it ties into the album title of A World Upside Down. As expected, this album has double or nearly double the dynamic range of all the previous albums I've covered on the channel. Classical music in general is known for having high dynamic range, which is to say it has large differences between quiet notes and loud notes in terms of volume. These dynamics are sometimes extreme, and that can make it hard to get the most out of classical music when listening at home. There are no requirements, of course, but it helps to have a music system and a listening space that enables you to hear the most quiet moments peacefully, while also allowing you to celebrate the loudest moments without running to the volume knob, all while maintaining clarity and depth within the listening soundstage. There's two listening modes that I switch between for classical music, and that's what I would call regular mode and critical mode. Regular mode is straightforward. Do I actually like what's being played? If I don't like it, then I don't listen to it. It's as simple as that. But critical mode is critical listening. Now that I like it, how much do I like it and why? Does it have realness and presence in the recordings? And does it have a well-mixed soundstage? Well, the soundstage on this album is impeccable. Here's what I hear in the mix. You got the solo violin placed center with the guitar and theorbo behind it, and behind that at the same depth are the harpsichord and the timpani, both of which fully spread out between the center, right, and left. Second violins, cello, and woodwinds are placed mid-left and mid-right, with the horns filling in the upper left and the upper right. Even when the players are going full force, there is clarity, texture, and location in the mix. And here's a fun fact. Classical music is unique in the fact that interpretations of what is right changes over time. The performances you hear today are not necessarily similar to the ones you would have heard 20 or 30 years ago. Because classical music is still heavily researched today, as new information comes to light about the composers themselves, their transcriptions, or their stylistic intent, performances are adapted to reflect that. This is important to say because I'm reviewing this album partly on the basis that to me it sounds incredibly right. I'm not a classical musician, but anyone paying attention to classical music over time as a listener will inevitably begin to like certain performances more than others. For example, here's two recordings that, in my opinion, encapsulate the fullest expression and experience of the music. 1. Giovanni Bottesini's Double Bass Concerto No. 2 in B minor, as played by Enrico Fagone on the album Duets. Number 2. Sofia Gubaidulina's Preludes for Cello, as played by Maya Beiser, which I heard on the Women of Note compilation album. I can't recommend these versions enough, especially the Preludes for Cello. So finally, on to the music of this review. The key tracks I've selected are the entire first two performances on the album. There's Concerto in D major and Flute Concerto in E minor. Concerto in D major has 3 movements, with the second movement being typically slower and less intense. And what I liked about this concerto is that every instrument seems to get its moment in the spotlight. Seeing as how the concerto is 21 and a half minutes long, this is what I need to avoid listening fatigue. The first movement starts with an impression of slow elegance from the strings and timpani, and then quickly speeds up. The first solo violin reminds me of a folksy fiddle, completely unpretentious and alive. It is joyous and invigorating. The horns sound fresh and natural, and the timpani is lean but close and punchy. The movement ends on a nice punchy timpani note. In the second movement, it starts slowly with the harpsichord and a mournful violin solo. You can hear the human movements of the music, the breathing, the lift of anticipation before the notes come in, and the fingers pressing down on the fingerboard of the violin when playing the trills. It has sweetness, but also hesitation and possibly fear or loss. I feel like it keeps switching between light and dark, colors, or ideas of good and evil. I also feel tension. The violin keeps you on a string while the orchestra keeps you anticipating another burst of robust rhythms and power in the third movement. And in the third movement, the oboe, flute, and violins do tease a little bit before rushing back in with the power of the timpani and the strings and the horns. It has a speedy violin being supported on accent notes from the orchestra while the harpsichord plays on. And as you think the piece might be ending, the orchestra comes to a full stop for the closing violin solo, which is perfectly mixed at a slightly lower volume, I think, to minimize the shrill frequencies and those delicate high notes, many of which sound to me like harmonics. When the closing violin solo finally kicks in to its highest gear, the timpani starts to gallop again and brings in the final 5-second climax, which in my opinion should have been louder and it should have been more final. It felt weak compared to the power that was exhibited in the first movement, and that is really the only fault I have of the whole performance, is that the end could have really ended harder. The next key track performance is the Flute Concerto in E minor, which has only 2 movements and a total playtime of less than 5 minutes. If you remember the Arctic Monkeys review, I mentioned how it felt like Alex Turner's head was right there in between the speakers, clear, sharp, and singing just to me. That's how this flute sounds, as if the player has set themselves down into your space purely for your enjoyment. It's very intimate and close, and that you can hear the physical movements and the pressing of the flute's keypads. In the first movement, I don't want to call it cheeky, but there's a certain sense that Vivaldi is giving and then taking away. The emotions evoked from the rhythms of the orchestra just before the flute dances in remind me of something romantic, yet something to be considered carefully. It's sensual and full of curious life, but also seems to caution you, all the same, to take it slowly. In the second movement, there's what I would call a musical soliloquy. Like good old Hamlet, the instrument has a clear voice and a story to tell you. There's no lyrics, of course, but the flute speaks with more than enough emotion to make up for that. There's a sense of recounting one's best moments in life right before the final curtain comes down. The life of the voice is coming to an end, and we are the lucky ones that get to hear its final notes, like a swan song. It is a beautiful escape into a different kind of musical dimension, not one that hits you heavy or really makes you think, but one that lets you feel light and feel comfortable letting go of everything. It's as if the flute is saying, "It's okay, just let go, you'll be fine." And on that note, I hope you're still with me, and I hope you're still feeling fine, because we've reached the end of the review. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with a friend, or simply click the like and subscribe buttons down below to let me know. Feel free to share your comments too. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this album. Until next time, this is Alex for Key Track Music Reviews, saying see ya.